Welcome to the Missing Dots, the place where silence is interrogated, forgotten truths are dragged back into the light, and the official story is never accepted at face value. Tonight, we step into the shadows of history, into a world where stones speak louder than scholars, and the desert preserves what empires tried to rewrite. Here, every assumption is challenged, every narrative is dissected, and every untouchable belief is placed under forensic scrutiny. If you're ready to confront the truths buried beneath centuries of noise, you're exactly where you need to be.
Yeah, and it is funny you mentioned stone speaking because for decades, really, Western academia was just absolutely convinced that the 7th century was, well, completely silent.
Right. And if you've ever looked at standard history books or, followed academic debates on the origins of Islam, you've probably been told that we really just don't know much about what happened in those first 100 years. There is this theory, one that completely upends the traditional timeline, suggesting that the entire story of early Islam, the companions, the early caliphs, and even the compilation of the text itself was essentially just retroactively invented.
Yeah, that's the Abbasid fabrication hypothesis. It gained a lot of traction in the 1970s with historians like John Wansbrough and Patricia Crone.
Okay, and what were they arguing exactly?
Their argument was essentially an argument from silence. They looked around and said, we don't see any contemporary paper records from the 7th century.
Right, because the books we have came later.
Exactly. All the major biographical dictionaries, the histories, the hadith collections, they were all physically compiled much later, like in the 8th and 9th centuries, mostly in Iraq under the Abbasid Empire.
So they just assumed that because the written books we have today were compiled later, the events described in them must have been made up later too.
That was the leap they made, yeah.
Yeah.
They concluded there was this evidentiary void in the 7th century.
And if there is a void, someone has to fill it.
Right. So they theorized that the Abbasid scholars projected this massive, highly detailed, basically fictionalized history into the past to legitimize their new empire.
Mhm.
I mean, they needed an origin story that justified their rule, their theology, and, their laws.
And I guess from a purely cynical perspective, you can kind of see why historians would suspect that.
Oh, sure.
Because if you are a new dynasty, right, and you've just overthrown the Umayyads, you're trying to unite a fractured, diverse population, what better way to do that than by inventing a pristine golden age that just so happens to conveniently support your current political structure?
It makes complete sense as a political theory. But the thing is, well, the flaw was really in where they were looking.
What do you mean?
These academics, they were looking for evidence in libraries, analyzing paper, parchment, literary transmission. They completely ignored the desert.
Because the answer wasn't like sitting on a bookshelf in Baghdad.
No, not at all. It was quite literally carved into the earth. And this is the counter evidence that just completely dismantles the fabrication theory.
We're talking about the open air archive of the Arabian desert.
Right, exactly. Thousands upon thousands of ancient inkless rock inscriptions, just ordinary graffiti carved into basalt and sandstone.
Which epigraphists call the first century epigraphic corpus.
Yeah, and it is a literal time capsule. We are talking about tens of thousands of texts carved by everyday people, not kings, but, shepherds, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims crossing the trade routes.
And a level of detail on these rocks is just staggering. I mean, we aren't just finding random names like Bob was here.
No, no, far from it.
We're finding the lineages, the tribal affiliations, the nosab. And when scholars take these rocks and cross-reference them with the classical biographical dictionaries compiled centuries later, like Ibn Saad's Tabaqat,
They match flawlessly. It is really incredible.
yeah, we are finding rocks naming prominent companions. Like there is a stone naming Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas dated 56 AH. And another one explicitly naming Khalid ibn al-Walid.
Right. The names carved in the desert perfectly mirror the names recorded in those later Abbasid era books.
But wait, let me pause here for a second. Because if I'm a skeptic listening to this, I am probably thinking about the nature of power.
Okay. How so?
Well, empires forge things all the time, right?
Yeah.
They have bottomless wealth, massive armies, clear political agendas. If the Abbasids wanted to invent a history to legitimize themselves, why couldn't they have just, hired a few hundred stonemasons?
And sent them out into the desert.
Exactly. Sent them out into the desert with a big list of fake names and told them to carve this fake history into the rocks. I mean, it sounds crazy, but governments have gone to extreme lengths to manipulate history. It kind of sounds like forging a million text messages from the past.
It is a fair suspicion. I mean, people do fake history. But that idea collapses the absolute second you look at the physical reality of the geography and, well, the nature of the inscriptions themselves.
So this wasn't some top-down coordinated imperial project.
Not at all. And we know that for a few reasons. First, the sheer scale of it. These inscriptions, they are not clustered around imperial capitals or major state highways.
Where are they?
They are scattered across thousands of miles of completely trackless, hostile desert. We find them in the Negev, across the vast Syrian desert, deep into Jordan, and all throughout the remote Hijaz.
So an Abbasid forger sitting in some comfortable court in Baghdad in the 9th century would have to somehow mobilize secret agents.
Right, agents who would travel thousands of miles into barren wastelands just to secretly carve names on random boulders. And all while hoping an archaeologist might stumble across them 1,000 years later.
Logistically, it's just absurd.
And socially, the writing is entirely grassroots. I mean, these aren't polished, monumental state decrees with official seals. The grammar is informal, the handwriting varies wildly, and the spelling is entirely vernacular.
So they are really just the spontaneous scratchings of anonymous nomads.
Exactly. You simply cannot fake the organic, chaotic distribution of thousands of individuals leaving their personal mark over decades.
Okay, so a mass forgery operation by sheer manpower is off the table. But that leads to another question.
Which is,
What about chemistry? Because we aren't just relying on the assumption that these people existed, right? There is physical science that proves exactly when the chisel hit the stone.
yes. And there is one specific stone found near Al Ula that really anchors this entire conversation.
You're referring to the Zuhair inscription.
I am. For anyone studying early Islamic history, this is arguably one of the most critical archaeological discoveries of the last century.
It was found in northwestern Saudi Arabia, and what makes it so special is that it has an explicit, undeniable date on it, right?
Exactly. 24 AH, which corresponds to 644 or 645 CE. The text is simple, but its historical weight is immense.
What does it say exactly?
It translates roughly to, in the name of God, I, Zuhair, wrote this at the time Umar died, in the year 24.
Subhanallah. At the time Umar died, in the year 24, that perfectly aligns with the exact historical date of Caliph Umar's assassination.
Right. It is a contemporary timestamp, carved just months after his passing. The author, Zuhair, was likely someone traveling through the region who just felt the heavy grief of the moment, and he decided to mark the occasion on a red sandstone rock.
But playing the skeptic again, how do we know a modern person didn't just walk out into the desert in, say, 1920 with a chisel and carve that sentence?
Because the rock itself keeps a biological and chemical record of its age. We use something called basalt patina analysis.
I was actually reading about this, and the best way I could visualize it is by thinking about human skin.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. How so?
Well, if you get a severe cut on your arm, your body immediately starts trying to heal it, right? It forms a scab, and then over years and decades, that turns into tough, aged scar tissue.
That's right.
So if someone carved a rock yesterday, the cut in the stone would look fresh. It would look bright and completely raw under a microscope. It wouldn't have the protective, aged scar tissue of 14 centuries.
That is a brilliant analogy, actually. In geology, that scar tissue is called desert varnish.
Desert varnish.
Yeah. The desert environment is full of dust that contains manganese and iron oxides. Over centuries, bacteria on the surface of the rock interact with these minerals, and they slowly bake a dark, shiny varnish onto the exterior.
So when a stone carver chisels into a boulder, they expose the lighter, fresh rock underneath. They basically break the skin of the rock.
Exactly. And the moment that fresh stone is exposed, the slow process of building up new desert varnish begins right inside the grooves of the letters. Modern laboratories can measure the thickness and the chemical composition of that varnish. We also use a highly advanced technique called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL.
Wait, I have heard of OSL used in archaeology, but how does it actually work? Because it sounds like the stone essentially traps a memory of the sunlight. How does a rock remember sunlight?
It comes down to the electrons inside the quartz and feldspar grains within the rock. Over time, natural background radiation in the earth causes electrons to become trapped in the crystal lattice of the stone. You can think of it like a battery slowly charging up in the dark.
Okay, charging in the dark. Got it.
But the moment you expose those quartz grains to sunlight, the trapped electrons are released. The battery is reset to zero.
Oh, I see.
So when someone in the 7th century chisels a piece of rock away, the freshly exposed surface gets a sunburn. The clock resets. Then, over the next 1400 years, As dust covers it or as the inner layers are shielded, the battery slowly starts charging again with trapped electrons.
So, by taking a sample to a lab, scientists can measure exactly how many electrons are currently trapped, which tells them the exact moment that specific cut was last exposed to the sun.
Correct. The microerosion, the desert varnish, and the OSL dating of the Zuhair inscription all independently confirm the exact same thing,
Which is?
that this carving has been sitting in that specific desert environment for 1400 years. It is scientifically impossible for an 8th century Abbasid agent or a modern 20th century forger to replicate that microscopic chemical aging.
So, the science literally dates the shadow.
Precisely.
And sitting here just thinking about the implications of that, it completely collapses the revisionist timeline, doesn't it?
It really does.
It proves that within a decade of the Prophet's passing, ordinary Muslims in the middle of nowhere were already using the Hijri calendar. They were literate, and they were documenting the deaths of their leaders in real time.
It entirely removes the evidentiary void we talked about earlier. The history wasn't projected backward. It was unfolding and being recorded by the people living it.
But of course, the critics don't just fold up their tents and go home.
No, they never do.
When the science proves the rocks are genuinely from the 7th century, they pivot. And one of the major criticisms they bring up next is the actual handwriting on these stones.
Ah, yes. The orthography.
Right. They point out that the Arabic looks, well, messy.
The way the words are actually spelled and constructed, yeah.
Yeah, if you look at the 7th century graffiti, it uses a script called Paleo-Arabic, or Hijazi script. And to a modern Arabic reader, it looks incredibly unstable.
It does lack the strict grammar rules of classical Arabic.
There are no diacritical dots. The ijam, right? To tell different letters apart, a ba, a ta, and a ta all look exactly the same.
And there are no vowel markings either, the tashkil.
Right, and they frequently just omit the letter alif entirely. They will spell a word like Rahman completely without the alif.
And revisionist historians seize on this.
Right.
They point to this wild variation and argue that if the script was this unstable and fluid, then the language itself must have been unstable.
Which implies what?
By extension, they argue that the Quranic text must have been fluid, evolving, and unreliable during this early period.
But there is a massive blind spot in that argument, right? Because when you take this messy stone graffiti and compare it to the earliest surviving Quranic manuscripts, like the Birmingham Folios or the Sana Palimpsest, they match.
The spelling is identical, yes.
This exact phonetic, dialect-heavy spelling, the missing aleph, the lack of dots, it perfectly mirrors the early written Quran.
Which tells us something deeply profound about their society. It proves that the early Muslims had a living, breathing oral culture. The script was never intended to be read in isolation by a stranger who didn't know the language.
It makes me think of how teenagers text today compared to a formal legal document.
How so?
Well, a teenager might send a text message saying, IDK, what you mean, completely dropping the vowels and ignoring punctuation. Now, if a historian 1,000 years from now found that text, they might conclude that the English language in the 21st century was broken or unstable.
That people didn't know how to speak properly.
Exactly. But the reality is the exact opposite. The teenager knows the language perfectly. The text message isn't a standalone document meant to teach someone English. It is a shorthand.
Right. It relies on the shared context between the sender and the receiver.
Exactly. The dropped vowels don't matter because the person receiving the text already knows what the words sound like.
And that is precisely how the early Islamic script functioned. The written text, the consonantal skeleton, or the rasm was just a physical anchor. It was a mnemonic aid.
So it was just a reminder.
Yes. The primary method of preservation was not the ink. It was the human chest. The Hufaz, the people who memorized the Quran, carried the text in their hearts. They didn't learn the Quran by sounding out the letters on a page.
They used the letters on the page to remind them of the sounds they had already memorized.
Precisely. So the fluidity of the script wasn't a danger to the preservation of the Quran because the script wasn't the primary source of truth.
The oral tradition was.
Yes. And the fact that the rocks in the desert share the exact same shorthand as the early manuscripts proves they belong to the exact same 7th century generation. They were writing in the vernacular of their time, using a visual prompt for an oral reality.
That context makes it so much clearer. But this brings us to what I think is the most difficult question in this entire subject. It's one that gets brought up constantly, and we need to explore it honestly.
Okay, let's hear it.
If these stones were carved by the very first Muslims, the companions and the generation immediately following them, Why do the earliest inscriptions rarely mention the Prophet Muhammad by name?
That is the most common polemic you will encounter.
Right. Critics will point out the Zuhair inscription mentioning Caliph Umar. They will point out other rocks mentioning Caliph Uthman. But they ask, where is the Prophet?
But where are the detailed descriptions of early battles like Badr or Uhud?
Exactly. And they argued, doesn't this silence prove that the Prophet was a minor figure who was elevated to his massive status much later by the Abbasid state?
To understand why that argument fails, we have to stop looking for what isn't there and closely examine what the rocks actually do say.
Because the language is different than what we expect.
Yes, the language of these early inscriptions is intensely, overwhelmingly personal. The vast majority of them are focused on two things: istighfar, which is seeking forgiveness, and Rama, seeking mercy.
So they aren't writing history.
Not at all. You see formulas like Bismillah and the declaration of absolute monotheism, La ilaha illa illah, everywhere. It is fundamentally about the individual's relationship with God.
And this introduces the concept of genre constraints, right?
Entirely. Desert graffiti is a genre of personal devotion. It is not a historical chronicle.
If you put yourself in the shoes of the people carving these stones, the psychology makes perfect sense. I mean, imagine you are a merchant or a soldier crossing a terrifying, barren desert in the 7th century.
It is an incredibly dangerous journey.
Right. The heat is brutal by day, freezing by night. You are facing thirst, wild animals, bandits. When you stop for the night, huddled by a fire, and you take out a tool to scratch something into a hard basalt rock, well,
You aren't going to carve a Wikipedia article about the political history of the state.
no, you are feeling your own mortality. You're going to ask God to forgive your sins. You want your name preserved alongside a desperate plea for mercy in case you don't make it out of the desert alive.
Exactly. We don't expect a hiker today carving their name on a tree in a national park to include a detailed history of their country's founding fathers.
Mm.
It is, a misunderstanding of human behavior to expect a scared traveler to write an encyclopedia. They were praying.
So the critics are essentially judging 7th century survival graffiti by the standards of a 9th century court history book.
They are confusing the genres completely. And furthermore, the claim that the prophet is entirely missing from the first century is simply false.
Oh, really?
Yes. As the Islamic State settles, as it gains resources and builds monumental architecture, explicit mentions of the prophet appear very clearly. Just look at the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, built in 72 AH.
Now that is a massive state project.
It is the first great architectural monument of Islam. And what is inscribed on it? Extensive Quranic verses, explicit anti-Trinitarian polemics, and the full Shahada, clearly stating Muhammad Rasul Allah.
So when they had the statecraft, the resources, and the public space to make declarations of faith to the world, they did.
Exactly. But out in the desert, on a lonely rock, they just wanted God's mercy.
That contrast between statecraft and personal survival is fascinating, and it highlights something else. Sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't what you find at a scene, it's what is completely missing.
You mean the negative evidence?
Exactly, the absence of anachronisms. Because if the Abbasids really did forge this entire history in the 8th or 9th century, their fingerprints would be all over this crime scene.
Oh, absolutely. A forger can never completely escape their own present.
Right. If you are forging a history to justify your current political reality, you inevitably inject your current political reality into the forgery. You literally can't help it.
It always, bleeds through.
It's like someone handing you a diary and claiming it was written by a teenager in 1992. You read the first few pages, and the author talks about wearing flannel shirts and listening to Nirvana on a Walkman. You might think, okay, this seems authentic.
Sure, that tracks.
But then on the next page, the author casually mentions that they spent the afternoon scrolling through TikTok. The illusion shatters instantly. You know it's a fake because anachronisms always give the game away.
And out of the tens of thousands of first-century inscriptions we have found in the desert, there are 0 TikToks.
None at all.
None. Think about the massive society-altering issues that define the Abbasid era. There were brutal theological debates, like the Mu'tazila controversy over whether the Quran was created or uncreated.
Huge debate.
There was the crystallization of the 4 major legal schools, the madhabs. There were intense political slogans and retrofitted family genealogies designed to delegitimize the Umayyads and prop up Abbasid rulers.
The society was deeply complex and divided.
Yet, absolutely none of that bleeds into the desert rocks. The theology found on these stones is primordial,
It's just the basics.
purely. It focuses on absolute monotheism, tawhid, and personal accountability before God on the Day of Judgment. It captures the raw, foundational essence of the faith before the complexities of imperial bureaucracy and scholastic theology layered over it.
Wow.
The profound silence of the stones on ninth century issues is the ultimate proof that they belong to the 7th century.
It really is an open air archive that refuses to be manipulated by later empires.
Absolutely.
Sitting here thinking about the science, the orthography, the human desperation of carving a prayer into basalt, it really makes you reflect on the profound nature of legacy.
It does. It shows how the smallest actions echo across time.
Think about Zuhair. I mean, in 24 AH, he was just a man feeling the heavy weight of a tragic moment, the sudden death of Umar.
Yeah.
He sat down and decided to carve his name and a date into a piece of red sandstone. He was just marking time, processing his own present. He had absolutely no idea that 1,400 years later, long after his bones had turned to dust, his casual scratching on a desert rock would serve as an impenetrable shield.
A shield defending the historical reality of his faith against modern skeptics he could never have imagined.
Exactly. He thought he was just leaving a record of his present, but he ended up protecting the future. It leaves you with a very quiet, very heavy question. What unseen legacy are you carving into the world today? And who might it protect 1,000 years from now? To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a tree. May Allah grant us success. Don't forget to go. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.